Hi everyone, welcome to our overview video as we transition out from our study of Abrahamic traditions and into indigenous traditions and modern movements. And we'll get a sense for what that means in a second. So here we were learning about the Abrahamic traditions. And hopefully after these last few weeks, you have a sense now for what was meant by how the shared creation story gives all three a similar foundation for their faiths. This origin story that says God created all things, including the first man and woman, and how eventually, due to our choices, we became separated or somehow estranged from God and the life that God had originally envisioned for us. And how, hopefully, all three of these religions say we can return back to proper relationship to God and to the type of life that God originally had wanted, a good life in harmony within the garden. As you learned about each of these traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, hopefully you saw how the language and the phrasing of their narratives gave us a different way of looking at the ultimate, the human condition, and the means of transcendence. And for people that don't delve too deeply into the mythos of these things, right, the experience that these words are trying to represent, if you don't do that from the outside, it sounds different, right? One worships Allah, the other worships God. But even just a simple closer inspection to see that Allah means God, right, in Arabic, can shed much more light into the similarities between these faiths. Hopefully you realize that it makes sense why these cultures would emphasize that particular language. I mean, think about the Jewish tradition and their history. Doesn't it make sense why the ultimate sort of relationship to God is within a promised land? Think about the origins of Christianity, where Judaism was under oppressive Roman rule. Doesn't it make sense that they'd phrase our right relationship with God as being the kingdom of heaven? And think about Islam and its origins within the Arabian desert. Doesn't it make sense how or why they phrase our right relationship with the ultimate as being one within the garden or paradise? So depending on cultural history, depending on geographical location, the language and the way certain things are described might sound different, when in fact there might be much more in common than you might first think if you don't take that additional step and were to take a closer look. The way you phrase things, the words you use are really important because that shapes your experience of life. I mean, think about the difference between I have been given a new opportunity to pursue a career versus I was fired. I mean, they could both be referring to the same thing and just as accurately. But because of the way you phrase it, that changes your whole outlook on it. That changes your enthusiasm for it. That changes the way you are experiencing it. So with all the religions we're learning about in class, we're learning different phrasing of life. We're learning different ways people have described their experience. And though from the outside looking in, they may sound different, what I want you to focus on, and what I've been asking you to focus on, is the mythos of these stories. What's the experience? Can you relate to that? So this is really important as we get into this week's topics on indigenous traditions and new movement traditions. Because on the surface, when you start to take a look at these, from the Abrahamic view, they may sound blasphemous because we're talking about all these other deities. We're talking about people that worship things that aren't called God. In fact, there are some movements that worship something and don't even believe in God. So from the Abrahamic narrative of the one true God, you shouldn't worship anybody but that God, no idolatry. From that perspective, when you take a look at indigenous traditions and new movement religions, they're going to look blasphemous because they're not worshiping the one God and they seem to be committing idolatry. What I want to ask you to do is take a step closer to try to get into the context of these faiths, of these movements, to maybe get a better sense of the description of life they're trying to get across. And then you might see how they may not really be committing blasphemy. So the three terms then that will help us to better understand the mythos of the religions or the spiritual movements we're talking about this week are going to be idolatry, worship, and sacred. Okay, let's go ahead and take a closer look at that. So idolatry. You may have been going through our modules on the Abrahamic traditions going, why do they despise idolatry so much? What's the big deal about idolatry? Idolatry obviously stems from the word idol. What do you think about when you think about idols? Maybe the show American Idol comes to mind, or just a general idea of, looking up to somebody or admiring somebody or trying to pattern your life after somebody, an idol. The English word idol can be traced all the way back to the ancient Greek term that refers to reflections in water. What does an idol have to do with reflections in water? Well, here you are standing over a pond and you see a reflection. That reflection is just a representation of something that is more real. Well, a lot of things are representations of reality. And when we're talking about God in the Abrahamic tradition, that would mean any image or statue, which is why within the Islamic tradition, you're not supposed to have a depiction or an image of Allah, right? No image of God, because that's a form of an idol. In Judaism, the sacred name of God is never supposed to be said because that name is just a representation of the real God. And often confusing in Christianity, the whole idea of God as triune, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Though one of the key features of seeing God as triune is that you can't see God, because the whole idea of one thing being three things is supposed to give us a sense of the mystery of God. That whatever God is beyond our comprehension. But the whole idea of a Trinity kind of points to the mysterious nature of God. God isn't just this, it's also that, but not just this, but also that. This multiplicity of God is pointing to the inherent mystery that we can't really pinpoint what or who God is. So all through the Abrahamic faiths, in the way they try to relate to God, understand God, talk about God, will acknowledge that anything we say or do or any representation isn't God, it's just an idol, it's a representation. Well, as you can imagine, idolatry then means worshiping those representations. So just imagine a religion that uses a name, uses an image, uses a concept of God over and over and over again, how certain people might start to believe then that name, that concept, that image is God, when in fact, no, those are just representations. So we have to be careful, say these religions, not to start to believe the representations are the reality that they're pointing to. Okay, again, why is this a problem? Two things I want you to think about. Underline, highlight, whatever you need to do to remember these. Two things. One, think about what you most value. This is a question we've looked at since the beginning of the term. And I asked you to take a look at your day. Do you remember this? And name activities that fill up your day and ask whether or not those activities are indicative of what you ultimately value. So let's say you value your family. Many of you said, yeah, I'm studying really hard because I want to get a good job to make good money so that I could be a better participant in my family's well-being, right? We kind of thought through and rationalized how the things we go about in our day actually help us towards the thing we most value. If you take a look at your own behaviors and other people's behaviors, don't they sometimes forget that? Don't they sometimes forget the point of working hard or getting a good job or making a lot of money, and they start to worship those things, forgetting that those were really there for you to, raise your family, for you to make sure your family is better off, for you to enjoy life more, whatever it is you ultimately value. But we can get lost. We can forget. We can get trapped worshiping our idols as opposed to the things that those idols represent, the thing that we most value. Think of somebody that works out a lot, right? If you ask them, oh, dude, why do you do that? Why do you work? They may say something like, I want to be healthy. I want to be healthy so I could be contributing to society. I want to be healthy and maintain my body so that it ages well and I could support my family. But then sometimes people forget that and they start to worship their body. They start to worship working out as if those are what's of utmost importance, forgetting that those are means to get to someplace else. Can you see now one way in which idolatry can be a problem? We forget what it is that these idols are representing, or we end up living a life that doesn't really pursue or is indicative of what we really value. The second reason why idolatry can be such a problem has to do with a story of a young man, let's say, who had never seen the moon or had never been taught what the moon was. So he goes to a wise sage and asks him, hey, what's the moon? I don't really know what I don't, I hear this thing called the moon. I don't know what it is. And the wise sage just points to the moon for him. Hey, that's the moon. And now the young person thinks he has it. Wow, thanks. Nobody gave me that information before. That's fantastic. I now know what the moon is. Thank you for that. So he goes back to all his friends who also don't know what the moon is. And his friends ask, hey, did you find out? Did you find out what the moon is? And the young man goes, yes, I found it. Here it is. And they all go, wow, awesome. I know what the moon is now. What happened? What happened was that the young man mistook the representation, the pointer, for the reality that it was pointing to. The problem for a lot of Abrahamic traditions with idolatry is that you end up not really valuing what it is that you really feel is of utmost value. And because you start to believe that your representation, whether it's your word, your concept, your image, is the thing itself, well, then somebody else might have a different representation. They might have a different word. They might have a different image. They might have a different concept. And now we start to argue because we think we are both right, but we think the other person's wrong because we don't say the same thing. One person says God, the other says Allah, and the other says Elohim, and they're arguing because they're have different pointers, different representations of the same reality. Can you see how a lot of conflict can come about because of that? So this is a reason, or a couple of reasons, why idolatry was so shunned, right? Was such a sin. Hopefully that gives you a sense of how to relate to idolatry or idols. Worship, because we just talked about idolatry being worship of representations. Well, what does worship even mean? Maybe you associate prayer with worship, or sacrifice with worship, or giving praise to something, right? Lots of churches will hear people sing, and lots of religious traditions there's dance and celebrations. It's about giving praise. The word worship has its roots in the idea of acknowledging something's worth. Acknowledging that something has worthiness to you. Another way of thinking about this in religious terms is it's acknowledging what is sacred to you, right? What is of ultimate worth to you. If you really take a close look at yourself, you can relate to this. There are things that you really find worthy of your attention, of your time, right? Of sacrifice for. Of course, the question here, as in addition to the Abrahamic faith, is what do you worship? If you take a look at your life and what you're acknowledging as being worthy based upon what you spend time thinking about and doing, are you really worshiping what you want to worship? As we go through the traditions this week, keep an eye out for what these different cultures worship. What is it that they acknowledge as most sacred? Which leads to the third term, right? Sacred. We've been talking a lot about sacred within the last 8-9 weeks together. And in fact, this might be as important a term as any term we're going to learn in our class. Important for two reasons. One is because when you take a look at the definition of a religion, in many books, in many academics' eyes, a religion is a tradition that acknowledges the sacred and binds people to the sacred. Traditions that acknowledge, that say, no, there's something sacred in life, and then binds people to it, right? The tradition shows people how to get connected to what is sacred. Can you see how that applies to the religions we've looked at so far in our class? The other reason why the word sacred is important is because the word sacred means important in many respects, right? The word sacred means worthy of respect, worthy of devotion. And even if you're not religious, again, it should be easy for you to relate to this. What is it that you think is worthy of respect? Other human beings? Freedom? Liberty? What do you think is worthy of devotion? Love? Compassion? Kindness? Another way of thinking about the sacred, something that inspires awe or reverence. Because when it inspires awe within you, that's probably something worthy of your devotion and respect. Have you ever seen people with great acts of courage in order to save those in danger? Doesn't that inspire you sometimes? Like, oh man, I can't believe that woman just jumped in and saved that kid. Isn't that worthy of your respect? This is what we mean by sacred, right? And when we take a look at all these religions and what they point to as being the ultimate, right, the ultimate reality, that will give you a sense for what they find most sacred. Think about Brahman. Think about the characteristics of nirvana. Think about the characteristics of the Tao. Think about the characteristics of God as we've seen it through the Abrahamic traditions. If you get a sense for what's being described there, you're going to get a sense for what these traditions think is most sacred, most worthy of respect, that gives them awe. Do you see now how these different myths, these different stories are ways in which people have tried to relate their experience of life? So what do you find sacred? If you can think of that, if you can imagine that, get a sense for how you can relate to that, you're going to have a better sense of how to relate to the mythos of the indigenous traditions and the new movement traditions we'll learn about in the upcoming week. But obviously, that'll give you a better sense of how to relate to all the religions we've talked about so far, right? Because for all these religions, including the ones that we'll take a look at this coming week, we are investigating people who have worshipped something that they found most sacred, often through some sort of idol, concept, name, image, even though all of these traditions will often say that the ultimate is beyond words. So while these terms, if taken from mythos perspective, will help us understand these traditions that we'll learn about this coming week, because we just came from the Abrahamic tradition, it's going to be very easy for us to compare, to try to understand the traditions this week based upon the stories and narratives we just learned about. And from these stories we just learned about, this week's traditions are going to sound like they're committing idolatry because they're worshiping the sun, rain, storms, Mother Nature in general, various other deities that sound like people. And it's going to sound blasphemous because we're going to be exposed to different creation stories, different narratives of how the world began. So it's going to feel as if they're not just different, but opposing the Abrahamic tradition. Two key things to keep in mind. One is, just like within the Abrahamic traditions where people have different language to describe the same reality, we're going to experience that too when we start to take a look at indigenous traditions from North America, from the Americas and from the Pacific, meaning people that live near the Pacific Ocean, right? Different language. So obviously there's going to be different ways of describing reality. But also, these people are not going to be thinking of life in the same way because of where they're from, because of the time period they lived in. So we have to keep that in mind. We have to keep that as a proper context so that we can better understand where these traditions are coming from. So how do you get a better sense for the mythos of what we'll be exposed to this coming week? In particular, for the indigenous traditions, what you can do to get a better sense of the mythos of these traditions is the following. Recognize that just as with the Abrahamic traditions, these indigenous cultures were often tribal in nature. There are several differences. One is simply geographical location. The Abrahamic traditions, Middle East, desert. The traditions we're looking at from the indigenous perspective this week, from the Americas, North America, South America, from the Pacific, people that live near the Pacific Ocean. Can you see a difference? Plus, these traditions were much less modern than what we saw in the Abrahamic tradition. Okay, so how does that inform the mythos of these religions? Here are keys to keep in mind. Well, they all live near more water, and they live closer to much more life, much more plants and vegetation and animals. Keep that in mind as you read these stories this week. Can you see how this has influenced how they describe life, the human condition, and what's ultimate in life? Two, these people, these indigenous cultures, were keenly aware that they lacked control. I mean, just think about how life is completely ruined with a bad storm if you're living as an indigenous culture. Think about how a flu, I mean, just a simple thing like the flu or cold could have a dramatic impact on your life. I mean, this is true of our lives too, right? But it often takes, the occasional forest fire where we can't even go outside to breathe, or the occasional earthquake, or the occasional storm for us to remember or even recognize that, man, there's a lot about our life that we can't control. Three, they were also then keenly aware of their mortality. They were keenly aware that at any moment that could be the end of their life. That each moment that they had was something that could not be taken for granted. Because everywhere they looked, they would see life being taken away out of no control of their own, right? Without any sort of warning. This is true our lives too, but how often do we live it as if we always had a tomorrow? How might reality be different if we realize that every moment, every breath could be our last? Keep these three in mind as you explore the indigenous traditions this coming week, and that might give you a better way of relating to the stories that you'll be reading. Okay? So that leads us to our Flipgrid assignment for this week, to start to get us into the mythos of these traditions. If today were your last day on Earth, what might you appreciate more about your life that you may have just taken for granted most of the time? And hopefully that gives a good start learning about indigenous traditions and new movement traditions in our module coming up.